The Munich Security Conference is an annual junket for some security officials, foreign ministers, heads of government, journalists, who discuss sort of the state of security. And this year, the main event was a speech by Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, who essentially said the same thing as J.D. Vance said a year ago, except he said it in more polite words. Another speech was by Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who told his European colleagues or his European hosts that Donald Trump is an aberration. He'll be gone in 3 years. If we come to power, we're going to reset the relationship. And I think this is nonsense. This is delusional. For the Europeans in particular, this is a very dangerous advice for them to accept. For starters, they did this before. This is exactly what they did when Trump came to power the first time in 2017. The view was he is an aberration. People got scared about his threats to leave NATO, but eventually they thought he would not prevail. And when he was defeated in the 2020 elections, the Europeans felt reconfirmed that it was a good thing that they didn't react to him or overreact to him. There were a few tariffs, there were a few policy issues during that period, but ultimately the Trump one term was not an issue. We're now in a very different situation. And the main reason why I think the relationship is not going to revert to the status quo ante is because we are creating facts on the ground. For example, NATO, we saw the US ambassador to NATO saying that we want the Europeans to take care of their own conventional security. This is essentially the US saying, we're absconding our responsibilities under NATO's Article 5 mutual defense clause. If Russia were to attack Europe, say it were to invade the Baltic republics, just give us this scenario, which I don't think is likely to happen anytime soon, but say we believed in this as some military folk appear to be. Whatever happens, the Americans will not come to the rescue. For the purposes of the most likely defense scenarios, we would be on our own in Europe. I think that's the new reality. NATO has changed, some subtle shifts have taken place. NATO has shifted the command structure. Europeans are now in charge of some of the top command positions in the NATO alliance, where Americans were previously in charge. For example, the Europeans are now in charge of one of the NATO command structures that takes care of Central and Eastern Europe. That was previously an American-led structure. So facts are created on the ground. Their worst-case strategic scenario, the one they're preparing for, is China taking over Taiwan simultaneously with North Korea attacking South Korea and Russia attacking Europe. So that would be the all-out all-out Eurasian war. In that war, if that's the scenario you're preparing for, again, I'm not saying this is a likely scenario. I actually don't think it is a likely scenario. But in their strategic thinking, that is the scenario they want to prepare for. And military people prepare for worst-case scenarios. They don't prepare for best-case scenarios. And in the worst-case scenario, there is no way the Americans can fight a war in Europe and in China and in Korea at the same time. The strategic idea of letting the Europeans be in charge of their own security makes complete sense from an American perspective. It also makes sense for the next administration to follow that approach, because what will happen, there will be differences. Say Trump leaves office in 3 years. There may be a new president. That president may be a Democrat. That president may well be Gavin Newsom. Will Newsom resurrect the status quo ante? Maybe in climate change policy, as he said he would. I would believe him on that point. In terms of the NATO command structure, why would he want to? Successive American administrations have pushed the Europeans to take more care of their own defenses, to spend more money on defense. And finally, this is happening. Why would a democratic administration want to undo this? It makes no sense at all. Obama wanted that, and Biden wanted that. It's not a Republican thing. So the Europeans would be delusional to think that in this one important issue, namely the responsibility for Europe's conventional defense, in this one important issue, that there will ever be a U-turn. Now, the transatlantic relationship may change, that the tariff spook might go. Maybe. Again, I'm not so optimistic as others are, because tariffs will be a part of plugging a fiscal deficit in the United States. The hope by the administration is that they'll collect annually about $300 billion in tariffs. Now, essentially, this is a tax on US consumers. Why would and the next administration want to get rid of it? They would have to plug the deficit. So where would they find the 300 billion that they collect in tariffs every year? So that once it becomes part of your fiscal infrastructure, it will be very hard to undo. And the same about NATO. Once it becomes part of your operational infrastructure, and these are the facts that we're creating at the moment. We're creating operational defense facts, we're creating fiscal facts. This will not go away. So the idea that the transatlantic relationship will return to the status quo after Trump is, I think, nothing short of delusional.
I watched the Rubio speech, and it is clear that he came to Europe, to Munich, to be the good cop. Last year we had J.D. Vance, who was the bad cop, but both cops worked together in order to help the Europeans get it. And I think the penny is dropping in the mind of our politicians. And what's that penny? Something happened back in 2008, which only now they are beginning to realize. Maybe it started before 2008, but the great financial collapse of 2008, I think, cemented that. During the Cold War, the coalescence of the West, of the NATO alliance, was based on two fundamental United States convictions and policies and views. One was that they too, just like the Germans and the French, feared the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was considered a clear and present danger for Europe. The second one was that the United States, since the Bretton Woods era, not just much more recently, has always seen the European Union as its own creation, had always seen the European Union as its own creation, a creation which was there in order to create aggregate demand for the first 20 years of the post-war era, the Bretton Woods period, for American exports, while America was a net exporter. And then after that, when it became a deficit country with the blowing up of the fixed exchange rates, the European Union became essentially a financer. The trade deficit of the United States was paid for with IOUs called US dollars. Those dollars were coming back from Europe and from Japan and later from China into Wall Street to finance real estate, the share market, and primarily the American federal government through US treasuries. So that was the basis of the global international rules-based, supposedly, order until then. But then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the great financial crisis of 2008, increasingly, we didn't have to wait for Trump to come there. I remember speeches and papers by Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary of Obama. It was very clear that they were looking at Europe as a problem. Jack Lew said to me personally that he considered the austerity policies of the European Union to be an attempt to export deflation to the United States. Those were the very words he used. Now, this is not very far off from what the Trumpian economists are saying, that essentially the Americans are providing a public good to the Europeans and the Europeans are freeloaders. So you could see that there was that shift. I believe that under Obama, with Mrs. Nuland going around Ukraine and causing havoc against the Europeans, remember what she said, F the Europeans, American administrations of both parties were orientating themselves towards decoupling from both these doctrines. The doctrine that Russia is a clear and present threat to Europe, they don't think that. They really don't believe this whole rhetoric that after Ukraine, the Russians are going to invade the Baltics and Poland and so on. The Americans don't believe it. Neither of the two parties believe that. The difference is what do they actually say in public and the way in which they say it. Trump is far more virulent on this. And the second one is the Americans don't consider Europe to be important anymore for its refinancing through its trade deficit. And I think that covers, it was evident that was the case also with Biden. Because, Biden, who was supposed to do that, which Gary Newsom is saying that will happen after Trump's second term, which is, to be the anti-Trump that reverses everything that Trump had done. Remember, Biden didn't do that. Firstly, he turbocharged the new Cold War that Trump had started against China. Right? He didn't take it back. He accelerated it. And through the so-called IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, what he did, Biden, was to create incentives for German and French and and Japanese companies to move to the United States. So, that he didn't use tariffs. He did use some tariffs. He didn't take tariffs that Trump had introduced out of the picture, but he created a massive subsidization project for effectively telling German companies, if you really want the dough that I'm distributing here, you have to come to the United States. That's quite different for Trump, but it really underpins this idea that the United States has pivoted away from Europe a very, very long time ago. And the Europeans are like headless chickens running around trying to work out what's going on. And, should they do as they did? And as Newsom suggests, that is wait for Trump to come out. And I think now they are realizing that they are going to be treated like a colony.
I think I agree with you, Yanis, on the issue that Biden did more damage to the Europeans than Trump. I'm slightly less optimistic than you are in the sense what you said in the beginning, that the penny is dropping. If the penny were dropping in defense matters, the first thing the Europeans would need to do is not only, or not even primarily, to spend more money on defense. The big disaster in European defense and the way Europe organizes its defense is the wastefulness, the duplication. I mean, we have 10 different battle tank systems in Europe. We have several fighter aircraft systems. If you look at all these weapon systems, there is a massive duplication going on because every country does it for themselves. A business consultancy last year checked out what the cost of producing ammunition is in Europe compared to Russia. And the ratio was approximately 1-4. So Russia has a cost advantage of 1-4 in ammunition. It also has a cost advantage in the production of other war machinery like tanks. The 1-4 ratio tells you what happens, what kind of surcharge price you pay when everyone does it for themselves. So if we are no longer protected by Americans, and I think that is, the U.S. ambassador to NATO's comments about Europe, now being in charge of its own conventional defense. This is not the violent rhetoric of J.D. Vance or the emollient rhetoric of Marco Rubio. It's just a fact. We are basically, home alone in NATO. If we were serious about this, we would be pooling our defense. We would be pooling our defense procurement at this point. Not in the EU. The EU can't do this. The EU doesn't have the ability under its current treaty laws to take an official role in defense policy. It can sort of operate on the edges of it, but it cannot take over defense policy. So it would have to happen inside of NATO, sort of like a European wing of NATO, where the EU, or where the Europeans, not the EU, where the Europeans, because Britain and Norway are important NATO members, where the Europeans would pool their defense procurement expenditure. Now, the countries in Europe that are most opposed
How can we do this, Wolfgang, when we don't have a federal structure?
No, I agree. The countries that are most opposed to that are France and Germany, because both of those countries have big defense industries. And the normal way these countries operate is they look after their own countries first. And I completely agree with you. Ultimately, all of these problems, we've had these discussions about the euro, about the sovereign debt crisis. We had these discussions about the collective action problem. People always come up with sort of some ideas. Oh, we need a Eurobond. Oh, we need a banking union. Oh, we need a capital markets union. It's all true. But none of these things, and the same with the procurement union. And I think you're absolutely right. All these things ultimately require the creation of a state. We have to be completely clear about this. We can talk about it more political integration. But ultimately, when it talks about geopolitics, when we're talking about, deploying geopolitical power in the way China does it, in the way the United States does, that requires the infrastructure of at least a small state, not a big state. It doesn't have to be, a state that.
I disagree. I think it needs to be a big state. You have to have a serious treasury in order to be able to have a proper military-industrial complex. But you know what? You misunderstood me, Wolfgang. When I said that the penny is dropping in the mind of our political leaders, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will do what is necessary to do. They are just realizing what needs to be done, but I have no idea of how to do it. Remember, Juncker once said that we know what needs to be done, but we don't know how to get re-elected if we do it.
I agree. Something like this is happening. And I compare this with sort of an old regime that's gone, a new regime that isn't there. And we're kind of in this no man's land intermittent phase where we've definitely departed the old regime, but we have not yet entered into the new regime.
You're becoming a Gramscian. You're quoting Antonio Gramsci from his prison notebooks. You're coming on my side of politics, Wolfgang.
You wish, Yanis.
No, actually, I don't, because it wouldn't be fun. I prefer you to stay where you are.